We start today in Louisiana with NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. She is in New Orleans traveling with the president. Monica, this trip is part of Biden's Getting America Back on Track tour. Why did he pick Louisiana, and what is his message for folks there?
There are perhaps no better examples than down here in Louisiana, Allison, specifically for what the president is talking about and trying to convince Americans and lawmakers alike to support in his infrastructure and jobs plan. When you look at the infrastructure here in the state, that gets about a D+ rating when we're talking about crumbling bridges, roads, and waterways. And of the thousands of bridges here in the state, more than 1,600 are described as in poor condition. That's why the one that the president used as his backdrop in Lake Charles earlier today, specifically, it was built more than 70 years ago and needs a lot of work to be repaired. So the president literally and physically using a backdrop to try to make this argument, but he's also tying it to something else, which is his desire to build climate resilient infrastructure. Take a listen to how he framed it just a little bit ago here.
We can't deny it. There is a real change in the weather. And if we go 1.5 degrees warmer, we're going to be in real trouble, a point of no return. Matter of fact, a lot of what we're going to have to build back now in terms of infrastructure. We got to build back to a different standard, not to what it was. It's got to be better because the climate has changed enough now that it's still going to rise 2 feet when it rains. We got to build for what is needed now.
So the president explained how all of this is connected in his view, and specifically when we talk about Louisiana as well, he's going to be coming here to New Orleans, Allison, to tour a water plant that has been damaged and actually led to some flooding here in recent years. He's going to talk about specifically the more than $111 billion that, if passed, the American Jobs Plan would go toward addressing America's water infrastructure all across the country. So he is leaving Washington to try to make this pitch and make the case that it's more critical than ever. And he did that also, we should point out, with a bipartisan group of leaders. There was a Republican mayor there in Lake Charles, as well as the Democratic governor. Another point he's trying to use in order to sell this massive and very expensive proposal.
Monica, the governor also briefed the president on hurricane damage there in Louisiana. What's the latest?
Lake Charles was hit particularly hard by a series of storms. And of course, New Orleans has that very intense and horrible history with Hurricane Katrina all the way back. But we look at the recent years as well. We're just weeks away, Allison, from the beginning of hurricane season. So that is really top of mind for everybody here starting June 1st. But all of these issues, again, the president is arguing, are connected. When we look at the broken water system and some of these storm water and all of the drainage, all of that here, particularly in this city that has been so hard hit, is a major issue that, again, is something that both sides of the aisle agree needs to be worked upon. The question is how, and then again, it's this other question of how is it paid for? The president, again, making the point that he does want the most wealthy Americans to pay more in taxes in addition to the corporations, he argued, who haven't been paying enough for far too long.
Yeah, Monica, anyone who's been to New Orleans can tell you how incredible it is to see how folks there always manage to bounce back, but they could certainly use some help. They have suffered so much from storm damage in particular. Another issue today, Monica, some new details about the administration's land conservation program. What can you tell us there?
This is something that the president, when he talked about addressing the climate challenge, set out a task force to address. And he wanted a couple of his different federal agencies to essentially take a look at this question. And so you have the Department of the Interior, Agriculture, Commerce coming together and releasing a report on progress of what they call the 30 by 30, which is that they want to basically conserve as much as 30% of America's land and parks by 2030. So we didn't get a ton of specifics in this, exactly how they're going to do it, but it's an indication of the first steps of progress in this arena, and one that really environmental activists have called for more action on. So this is really just the beginning to that process, but one that the president and this White House and all of these different federal cabinet secretaries have said they're very committed to doing. Again, it's a goal that's in line with their climate work, which they do want and know it will take years. It's not going to happen overnight, but most likely they have these benchmarks they'd like to hit over the next decade or so. Allison.
All right, Monica Alba, what looks like a gorgeously warm New Orleans today. I'm jealous of all those people walking behind you in shorts and sleeveless shirts. Monica, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks like it. Next up, an NBC News exclusive. The first migrant family separated during the Trump administration reunited under President Biden. But more than 1,000 families are still split apart. NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff talked with DHS Secretary Mayorkas about bringing those families back together.
Mr. Secretary, earlier this week I was with Brian, who was reunited with his mother after over 3 years apart following their separation by the Trump administration. His mother is here on temporary status, as you know, which doesn't protect her from a future deportation nor from a future separation from her son. Can you guarantee that she and the other reunited families will be able to stay in the United States permanently?
We are very much focused on providing stability to the reunited families. Not just for her, but for the family as a unit. It's not something we can guarantee at this point in time, but we are dedicated to achieving more than what we have delivered thus far. This, I think, is a temporary measure. Unite the family, reunite the family, and then let's work together with those representing the family to see what we can achieve under the law, and I think what these families both need and deserve.
What I think I hear you say is, it's going to work out, but you're not able to guarantee it yet.
We're going to do everything we can to make it work out.
You all have had great success in moving unaccompanied migrant children out of Customs and Border Protection custody, Border Patrol custody. But Health and Human Services has over 22,000 children in their custody, and that is by far a record number. You don't seem to like the word crisis, humanitarian crisis, or otherwise. Can you explain why it seems like having such a large volume of children in the custody of the U.S. government, while manageable, is a crisis in the humanitarian nature?
We were executing on our plan. A plan takes time, and especially so because we had to rebuild an entire system that was dismantled. But we knew what we were doing, and we were doing it. It's hard, and therefore it's a challenge. But a crisis implies a lack of control, a lack of a plan that one is executing, and that was just not true. And we've proven that to be the case.
And Jacob joins me live now. Jacob, great interview. I know you also asked Secretary Mayorkas about ending Title 42. It's a rule the Trump administration used to expel migrants during the pandemic. What do you say about that?
Well, that's that policy, you know, Allison, that's also creating a different type of family separation because only minors are allowed into the United States. There are documented cases, and the secretary has said this, of children leaving their families behind at the border and going into the United States on their own because it's their only chance. He sees a clear distinction between those types of family separations and the intentionally cruel family separations under the Trump administration. And he also said he'd like to find a way to end those as soon as possible.
Jacob, you also asked the secretary about the impact of climate change on immigration. What did he say about that, and how is the department adjusting there?
I thought that was a fascinating part of our conversation because it's very clear, not just with the two hurricanes that hit Central America earlier over the course of the last couple months, but for years now at this point, the impacts of climate change have exacerbated food insecurity, malnutrition, poverty, and starvation in many cases. And he knows that. And what I asked him was, should we have a climate refugee or climate asylum status to account for people who might come here because of that and get turned away? He said very candidly it was something that he had not thought about, but he was willing basically to take under advisement and talk about with folks at DHS at a time when climate change is becoming an increasing factor in the reasons people leave and come to the United States.
It is an NBC News exclusive. Jacob Soboroff sitting down with the DHS Secretary. Thank you so much, Jacob. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
A showdown at the State House. Protesters packed inside the Capitol building in Austin, Texas today, where lawmakers are voting on House Bill 6. It is the latest attempt to pass restrictions on voting. NBC News Now correspondent Priscilla Thompson is at the State House. Priscilla, what specifically are Texas lawmakers voting on today, and how is that vote going so far? What do you know?
Well, Allison, they were supposed to vote on that controversial House bill, which would have had measures and provisions in it, like limiting distribution of vote by mail applications. It would also have required anyone assisting someone at the polls to fill out a form detailing why that person needed assistance. And one of the most controversial things in it was the protections that it provided to partisan poll watchers, like allowing them to film any voters that they felt were doing something illegal or unlawful. And so this was supposed to be first on the calendar this morning. However, I would tell you we are 5 hours into the session today, and it has not yet come up. Multiple sources telling us that there may be some conversations going on behind the scenes about possible amendments. And that is because Democrats today were prepared to come with more than 100 amendments to this law, which likely would have taken hours to get through. But I am just being told that this bill should be coming up in the next couple of bills, but unclear what the timing on that is actually going to look like. But at some point today, Allison.
Priscilla, protesters packed into the gallery today. Let's talk about why they're opposed to HB 6.
Yeah, those demonstrators showed up bright and early this morning to line the walkway as lawmakers made their way onto the House floor, holding those signs showing that they were in opposition to this law. I had an opportunity to speak with one of the organizers of that demonstration from Texas Rising and take a listen to what she had to say about why they are opposing this bill.
This legislation hurts voters of color, hurts voters, young voters, hurts voters with disabilities. These lawmakers should not be passing this legislation. These folks behind me are a representation of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of Texans who would lose their right to vote if these bills were passed. So we will be meeting them at every step of the way.
And those folks, once the session got underway, did make their way upstairs to the gallery, and they have been there for the past several hours waiting for this bill to come onto the floor. Allison?
Priscilla, Texas is a Republican-leaning state. It has a Republican legislature. If this bill passes, what happens to it next?
Well, everyone I've spoken to says that they do expect some form of this bill will ultimately make its way to Governor Abbott's desk before the end of this session. And I actually caught up with Congressman Joaquin Castro and asked him about what comes next if that happens. Take a listen to what he had to say about the potential fallout.
Texas will have the most restrictive voting laws in the country. We will challenge it in the courts. I think there will be repercussions from what we've heard from the business community because Texas is doing this, because people see it as a fundamental issue of fairness. It makes it harder next time to go tell people, hey, go vote. It's going to make a difference. These guys are making it harder to do that.
And of course, if this bill is voted out of the House today, it would then go on to a committee before making it to Governor Abbott. And so there still could be some changes happening. We won't know exactly what is in that final bill until Governor Abbott signs it into law. Allison?
All right, Priscilla Thompson in Austin, Texas. Thank you so much. Florida changing its voting laws today. Governor DeSantis signing a controversial bill that makes it harder to vote, particularly absentee. And he signed it live on Fox News. NBC News correspondent Sam Brock has more.
Hi, Allison. A lot of news from Florida today, where it just became the latest state to pass a package of rules that make it harder to vote. But it also becomes the first swing state that voted for Trump to do something like this. Governor Ron DeSantis signed Senate Bill 90 into law at 8:45 this morning. He said in the name of transparency, but he did it in a room that featured only one news outlet, Fox News, and that's it. Everybody else was denied access. Governor DeSantis later in the day did hold a press conference where he answered two questions, one on hurricane infrastructure and one on the legislation. So let's talk about what the legislation actually does. It limits drop boxes, which is to say you can't drop off your mail-by-vote ballot unless it's during early voting hours. And if there is someone physically standing over the box, it requires identification for obtaining a mail-by-vote ballot. It also requires third parties not to be able to distribute anything that would influence hurts a voter, and food and water may qualify under that, and it bans private grant money from going to election supervisors that actually run these elections. We spoke with Dr. Jeremiah Chin, who is a constitutional law professor and expert at St. Thomas Law here in Miami. Here's how he put the whole thing in context of the kinds of legislation being passed in Florida right now.
I see a pattern of laws that are attempting to sweep broadly, criminalize things of speech, voting rights, largely seem racially motivated in response to movements for racial justice that we've seen over the past year. So the pattern is definitely there. A lot of this legislation to me looks like a large straw man. You're constructing an enemy, you're constructing fraud, you're constructing riots, you're constructing an opponent that doesn't practically exist, but are now orchestrating legislation that's going to radically and dramatically alter the democratic process that we see throughout the United States.
Governor DeSantis said that these rules are really important to make sure that you are who you say you are when you vote. But it's also worth noting that in 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States dismantled the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a portion of that which created supervision of southern states that had a history of discriminatory voting. And here we are today. A number of groups have filed a lawsuit against DeSantis and against the state of Florida, alleging that very thing, discrimination. Reporting from Miami, Sam Brock, NBC News.
Let's check in with NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce. She's got the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Hi, Simone.
Hey, Allison, we're starting with some news on the Twitter front. Twitter is suspending a Donald Trump-related account called From the Desk of Donald J. Trump. The company saying it violates their ban evasion policy, writing, quote, "We'll take enforcement action on accounts whose apparent intent is to replace or promote content affiliated with a suspended account." The former president, of course, was banned from the platform back in January. Well, President Joe Biden meeting his goal of having most elementary and middle schools open for full in-person learning within his first 100 days. 54% of public schools below high school are offering in-person learning, according to a new Education Department survey. But about 4 in 10 students are still choosing to take all of their classes remotely. Well, in some international news today, the UK and France engaging in a naval standoff in the English Channel because of an ongoing dispute over fishing rights. France and Britain each deploying 2 patrol boats off the island of Jersey as French fishermen protest for what they say are their post-Brexit fishing rights in the area. The French government suggesting it could end up cutting power supplies to the island. Well, Pfizer and BioNTech say they will donate their COVID vaccines to help vaccinate athletes participating in the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games. Initial doses are expected to be delivered to participants at the end of May, with the goal of ensuring that they get their second dose well before the games begin this summer. This story is about to blow your mind. A woman from Mali, Africa, giving birth to 9 babies at once after only expecting 7. The country's health minister is saying the 5 girls, 4 boys, and their mother, who gave birth prematurely at 30 weeks, are actually all doing well. The Guinness Book of World Records telling the AP that its current record for most living births at once is 8, and that they are working on verifying this birth. So, as if it weren't enough that she got a couple of surprise babies in there, she also gets a world record.
Talk about a good day, huh? Man, that's accomplishing things. Simone, thank you so much. Reunited, and it feels so good. Dozens of fully vaccinated seniors in New Jersey seeing their families for the very first time since the pandemic started. Ellison Barber is at MetLife Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey, where those reunions are happening. Ellison, what a feel-good story after all of the tough reporting that you've had to do over the past year. Tell us about the lucky families you met there today.
Yeah, this stadium, it's empty right now, and they're in the middle of cleaning up. But for a few hours this afternoon, this place was just filled to the brim with joy. About 24 families were reunited here for the first time since the COVID pandemic hit. They hadn't seen each other in person. So many hugs missed out on, but everyone made up for it right here this afternoon. Listen to some of what the families we met had to say.
Obviously very emotional. I was emotional watching the other people meet their families, but this is awesome. We get to celebrate her birthday.
It's just because we FaceTime all the time, so she already knew who I was. So it was neat.
Yeah, there was a recognition factor there from FaceTimes that was helpful, but nothing's like a hug.
It was like hitting the lottery. A ton of money put a big smile on my face, and that's what they did. Yeah, nothing could top that.
The last woman you heard from there, Love Smith, she was talking about just finally being able to see her two granddaughters, one who is 9, the other is 2.5. And they change so much at that age. So to actually get to see each other in real life, hug each other, she said it was indescribable. The first person you heard from there was Peggy Broda. We actually talked to her last night via Zoom when she'd first gotten into town. Most of the seniors who were here live in South Florida and came up just for this, all of them fully vaccinated, but some had a little shorter of a journey to travel. The Brodas came from Massachusetts on a train. Their daughter, Adrian, lives in Brooklyn with her husband, James, and their 2 children. Their daughter, Gray, is 4. She turns 5 tomorrow. Their youngest child, Shep, is only 9 months old. He was born during the pandemic, and because of that, his grandparents had not been able to hold him or hug him. That hug that I think we showed you at the beginning was the first time they were able to pick that baby up and finally give him a hug and spend some time with him in person. Allison.
Oh, Allison, you are killing me. You already hold the News Now record for making me cry. This time, though, happy tears. This is a first, so this is so wonderful. So tell us about this event. Who organized it? Who got all these families together?
So Clear, the people that you see at airports doing, helping people get through security a little bit quicker, I think. I think that's kind of how they focus on. But basically, their CEO had this idea that she thought, wouldn't it be neat if we could reconnect families who have been separated? So sort of through word of mouth, they found these 24 different families that hadn't been able to see each other. United Airlines then got involved, and they paid for and chartered a flight from Fort Lauderdale up to Newark with 30-something seniors who live in South Florida so that they could be here for this moment. It really, from what everyone has told us, it really just started with the CEO of this company saying, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? So they started to put wheels in motions, and they were able to do it. And 24 families got to be reunited for the first time, and again, a year and a half today. Allison.
Oh, a very cool idea indeed. So glad you were there to see it all. Thanks for sharing this. This really warmed my heart today, and I think we all needed a little bit of that. Amazon standing by its decision not to remove a controversial transgender youth book from its site. The book is called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. It's by Abigail Schreier. LGBTQ plus advocates calling it harmful to transgender youth. NBC Out Associate Editor Joe Yerkaber reporting on this story for us. All right, so Joe, I just have to ask, what is this book about?
Yeah, so this book is primarily aimed at parents. You can take a look at the Amazon description, which says in part, a generation of girls is at risk. And Schreier's book will help you understand what the trans craze is and how you can inoculate your child against it, or how to retrieve her from this dangerous path. The book also takes the stance that children are being, quote, fast-tracked into transition.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on at Amazon. Dozens of employees there are filing an internal complaint. They say this book violates the company's policy against selling books that frame LGBTQ plus identity as a mental illness. We know Jeff Bezos has vocally supported LGBTQ plus rights in the past. So what's Amazon saying today about its decision to keep this book online?
So Amazon has issued a statement. A spokesperson told NBC News in an email that as a bookseller, they believe that providing access to written speech and a variety of viewpoints is one of the most important things they do, even when those viewpoints differ from their own or from Amazon's stated positions.
So, Joe, this book has been called transphobic. Clearly, the transgender community would like it removed. How's the author responding to all of this criticism? What is she saying?
Schreier responded yesterday on Twitter. You can take a look at her tweet here where she says, anyone who thinks my book advances a narrative of transgender identity as a disease hasn't read it or is a, quote, bona fide idiot.
I always love when people go for that argument. If you can't beat them, might as well call them an idiot. Joe Yerkeba, we always love having you on. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
You can still see the damage today. More than 50 years ago, a highway tore through the heart of Rondo, St. Paul's largest black community. This is a story that has repeated itself countless times in countless places across our country. President Biden now wants to invest $20 billion of his infrastructure plan in transportation for those communities. NBC News Now correspondent Maura Barrett takes us to Rondo.
We're walking over I-94.
And this all used to be houses and businesses.
This was all houses. This is Rondo Avenue here. There were 4 shops right on that corner there. Every cross street would have a grocery store. So it was a walking community.
So you grew up on this block?
I did. You knew pretty much everyone who went, drove, or walked down the street.
The Rondo neighborhood was the heart of the black community in St. Paul, Minnesota. Starting in 1956, the homes, businesses, community centers decimated by the construction of a freeway. As a girl, Margaret Lovejoy watched it all happen.
I can relate it to living in a war zone for probably 5 or 6 years. First, it was the neighbors moving out. They had to move. And then their homes were destroyed. And to this day, I can see and feel that impact of that house just falling apart. Because I knew who had lived in that house.
That freeway is like a big, deep, open wound right in the middle of our community.
But it wasn't just here. In Florida, Overtown was the center of Black Miami. The I-95 tore through the neighborhood, wiping out countless homes as well as its thriving business district. In New Orleans, Louisiana, the I-10 cleared through North Claiborne Avenue, the center of a stable Black Creole community. Kansas City, Chicago, Boston, Detroit, New York City, Montgomery, Los Angeles, the list goes on and on.
An automotive age, traveling on time-saving superhighways.
The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 was one of the largest public works projects in American history. It added 41,000 miles to our interstate system. But it also displaced over 475,000 households between 1957 and 1977. A great many of those people were Black.
At the time, local governments were pursuing slum clearance projects. They leveled, quote, blighted areas all in the name of urban renewal. But blighted often just meant Black or not white. It didn't matter if the community was thriving economically.
The physical building of the highway destroyed Black communities. Black residents and families lost their home, which was their primary financial investment. They often did not get any reimbursement or sufficient reimbursement for that loss.
Melvin Carter is now the mayor of St. Paul.
Okay, so there's my grandpa.
His family lost their homes and business properties on Rondo.
I think about how my life might be different had I inherited the wealth, the properties, real estate that my grandfather and my grandmother began amassing on Old Rondo. And it seems like there could have been a different storyline there.
Before I-94 construction, Rondo was the only Black community in St. Paul not considered a slum. After the highway, property values fell. But infrastructure didn't just break up Black communities. It reinforced segregation by way of dead-end streets, often at the intersection of Black and white communities, lack of sidewalks, and low-clearance bridges, purposely built to block public transportation like buses.
In many ways, big and small, we've used infrastructure and transportation policy to make it difficult for people to access other communities, for people to access opportunity, and for people to maintain that sense of community.
It's a tactic that was encouraged by the federal government itself. The 1938 Federal Housing Administration Underwriting Manual said an artificial barrier like a highway could protect a neighborhood from, quote, adverse influences like, quote, inharmonious racial groups. We still see the effects today. The Staten Island Expressway is referred to by some as the island's Mason-Dixon line. Black households on the island are concentrated north of the expressway. South of the expressway, the number noticeably drops. The Biden administration could be taking the first step to rebuilding these communities.
There is racism physically built into some of our highways. And that's why the jobs plan has dollars specifically committed to reconnect some of the communities.
President Biden's infrastructure plan seeks to invest $20 billion in transportation for communities harmed by past highway projects. Biden's plan hasn't been passed yet, but the people of Rondo are making plans to move forward on their own, with or without it.
Physically, we would like to reconnect both sides of the freeway by putting a land bridge over the freeway, and you'll be able to walk on it. You'll be able to have housing on it. We'll be able to have places for small businesses, cultural center, a marketplace, an amphitheater.
This time, the construction aiming to create opportunity for their future generations, built anew on top of their family's past pain.
Rondo is not a unique situation. It's nationwide. Anywhere there's a interstate. But the DNA, the heart of community, I still think survives in people who were displaced.
It is time for the bottom line, our daily look at what's going on in the business world and beyond. Jobless claims hitting a new pandemic low today. 498,000 Americans filed for first-time unemployment benefits last week. That is the first time they've dropped below 500,000 in over a year. So how is the job market looking? Here's NBC News senior business correspondent Stephanie Rule.
It's Thursday, which means we have the weekly jobless claims. Just under 500,000 Americans filed new claims in the last week. And while we always wish that number was lower, comparatively speaking, it's very low. We haven't seen a number this low since last March, just about when things started to shut down. So it's very good news. Across the board, as more Americans are getting vaccinated and regulations are being lifted, we are seeing people get back to work. So much so that employers across the country, from restaurants to hotels, even manufacturing, are saying they're struggling to find workers. It's a really extraordinary time in this country because whether you were someone who over the last year were working from home and you had increased savings, or you're someone who hasn't found work yet and got stimulus money, there's a lot of stimulus money in the system. People are out there spending. And when we're spending in bars, restaurants, hotels, where we've really wanted to go over the last year, those businesses need to hire workers. And there's a big demand to hire those workers.
It's probably not a money issue. It's likely a mindset issue. Let's get into it.
That is Tiffany, the budgetnista Aliche, a former preschool teacher turned America's favorite financial educator. This February, she became the first Black woman to appear solo on the cover of Money magazine. We are so psyched that she is here for our Working Women's Week on News Now, where we're trying to help women tackle the pandemic she session together. Tiffany, thank you for being here. So let's get to it. For anyone considering maybe a career change right now, you started as a teacher. How'd you get into personal finance?
So I got into personal finance because it was something that I grew up with. My father was a CFO and an accountant, and he and my mom talked to my sisters and I about money all the time. So I was the go-to girl in my friend group when it came to money.
Oh, my God, this sounds like my family. I'm the daughter of a CPA. My parents run an accounting practice, and I'm the person that my friends are always asking about their taxes or their mortgages or whatever it is. I can relate. All right. So here we are in a pandemic. It is really tough to predict a pandemic, but you say that we can all absolutely prepare for a recession, and we should expect several in our lifetime. I mean, hell, I'm only 41 and I've already lived through 6. So how do you recession prep?
Well, first of all, hey, twin, I'm 41 as well. And so one of the ways that you do so is you recession prep by learning to live under your means, if possible, learning to set aside for emergencies, and learning how to activate earning more when you need to. So when I was a teacher, I used to babysit when I needed extra money, or I used to tutor when I needed extra money. So certainly we can not fully recession proof our lives for some folks, but certainly make it a lot easier to manage and work our way through it.
All right, you have a new book out. It's called Get Good with Money, 10 Simple Steps to Becoming Financially Whole. What does becoming financially whole mean?
So financial wholeness is when these 10 steps come together to create a foundation that is not easily shaken, no matter what's happening externally with your money. So those steps are going to ensure that if there is a recession, if there is pandemic or quarantine, that you're able to not only survive through it, but also thrive through it.
Your book has a 10-step plan. I don't want to give away all the steps because I want people to go out and read your book. But hit us with a couple of them. What are some of the things you can sort of get started down the right path?
Well, first, let's talk about credit. So the FICO credit score, which is the score that's most used, ranges from 300 to 850. And people think they have to have an 850 in order to be offered the best interest rates, but that's not true. 740 is the beginning of a perfect FICO score. So at least if you get a 740, you'll be able to get the same interest rate as your friend with the 800. Another thing I want you to consider is I want you to consider learning to earn. This is a critical component of financial wholeness. We all have to know how to make additional money. Most of us have a traditional job. So create something that I like to call my Go Me folder. So the Go Me folder is whenever you helped directly or indirectly for your company to make money or save money, you keep it in your file in this folder. So when you go for your review or when you ask for a raise, you're able to say, here's how I can quantify why and how I should get a raise, right? And last but not least, estate planning. So many of us ignore estate planning because we're like, we don't have an estate, but you do. Do you have a bank account? Do you have a retirement plan or maybe a pension? Your beneficiaries, if you put them on those accounts, that is the beginning of an estate plan. You want to make sure should something happen to you that the people you want to have access to your assets do so easily.
All right. We got to talk about being financially literate. This is something that's really important. But a lot of people, they can't afford an MBA or classes in finance. That's a big expense. How can you become more financially literate? How can you become more savvy on things like estate planning and all these topics that you may not know that much about? How can you do that on the cheap or even for free?
Well, I mean, not to toot my own horn, but you can go ahead and get good with money. Even if you can't afford the book, you can borrow it from your local library, right? But also not just that. I love podcasts. I have a podcast called Brown Ambition. You can listen to financially focused podcasts. You might have maybe your favorite financial educator has a YouTube channel like I do, and you can lean into it. You want to be mindful of who you follow on social media, really trusted sources, but you can tap into podcasts, YouTube channels, social media channels, and books via your library to get this additional information that is critical in this day and age.
All right, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I'm going to ask you for some parting words of financial wisdom. But before you give us those, can I get you to promise us that you'll come back? I just feel like you are a kindred financial spirit. We're the same age. We grew up in the same kind of background. You have fantastic advice. Our viewers need more from the Budgetnistas. So can I pressure you to come back and see us again?
Yes, of course. I'll definitely come back.
All right. How about those parting words of wisdom?
So here are my parting words of wisdom. If you don't do anything else, I want you to consider integrating automation into your finances. Automation is the new discipline. You don't know how to budget? Ask your job to split it before you get it. Ask them to split your bank account or your paycheck into specific bank accounts so you don't have to worry about those transfers. Make sure that you are automatically saving, automatically investing for retirement, automatically donating if that's what you choose to do. But automation is the new discipline. Split it before you get it.
I love it. Split it before you get it. Set it and forget it. I love it. Tiffany, the Budgetnista, so awesome to have you on today. I can't wait to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our Working Women's Week wraps up tomorrow with Morning Joe co-host and Know Your Value founder Mika Brzezinski. Mika has great advice on asking your boss for flexibility, staying in the game if you're working from home, and getting back in the game if you're out of work. You can catch our conversation right here on News Now from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Who wins and loses when short sellers, social media, and retail investors collide? That is the hot topic on Capitol Hill today. The new chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission fielding questions from the House Financial Services Committee about the wild moves we saw in stocks like GameStop earlier this year. So will the SEC change its rules to make it tougher to gamify Wall Street trading? Here to help answer that question, NBC News national political reporter Sahil Kapoor. Sahil, a new SEC chair Gary Gensler saying in his prepared remarks that a lot of the SEC rules that were designed to protect investors were written way before trading went online. So what is the SEC going to do to adapt here?
And this was the biggest part of Gensler's message, Allison, that the SEC needs to revisit its rules in order to adapt to a situation where investors can be protected from the kinds of wild swings we saw in GameStop stock earlier this year. Let's have a listen to what Gensler said at the hearing.
The SEC must remain attuned to rapidly changing technologies with an eye to freshening up our rule set where appropriate to continue to achieve our mission. If we don't address this now, the investing public, those saving for future retirement and education, may shoulder the burden later.
And this, of course, dovetailed an age-old disagreement between Democrats and Republicans on the panel. Democrats who were saying there need to be tougher rules on this to protect investors, to protect ordinary people, while Republicans were warning that stricter rules, elevated regulations could only make it more difficult for people to enter the market and ordinary people to start investing and to try to save for their future.
Sahil, there should also be rules about having to say GameStop stock on air. It is one of the hardest things that I have had to say all year. It's impossible to not mix the two of them up. I do it every time we do this story. So let's talk a little bit more about GameStop. Short selling was a big part of the crazy moves we saw in GameStop's stock in March. For our viewers, short selling is when you borrow stock and then you sell it, hoping you could buy it back cheaper later. Now, with GameStop, there was a short squeeze. All those investors who bet on the stock going down had to cut their losses and buy back their short shares as the stock was jumping higher. The SEC has been looking at short selling. Is Gensler planning on making any changes there?
Well, the short answer is he said he has asked his staff to prepare recommendations on a category of types of trading, including short selling. Let's just turn it over to what Gensler specifically had to say about your question there, Allison.
Under Dodd-Frank reforms, the SEC received mandates and authorities to increase transparency in the market. So I've asked SEC staff to prepare recommendations on transparency in short selling, stock loan markets, and something called total return swaps.
Now, he didn't get particularly specific about what that would mean, but the signal is there for everyone to see that Gary Gensler and the SEC are watching this, and they believe that there needs to be some changes in order to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. Now, Gensler, interestingly, he has a background of being an investment banker from decades ago, but over the years, he's cultivated a reputation as being a tough market cop. Someone who can be, confrontational with Wall Street and who kind of suits some of the more economic populist flavors of President Biden's platform, which is one of the reasons he's in this job.
Sahil, today's hearing was pretty respectful, but there's a little heat between Congressman Bill Huizenga and the SEC chair. What happened?
It was an interesting moment that, again, kind of gets to some of the tension between the Republican side and where this new Democratic administration is going in terms of rules on trading in Wall Street. Let's have a listen to that exchange between Congressman Huizenga of Michigan and Gensler.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do want to be clear. So it is not gambling in a casino.
It's risk taking, and risk taking can be in different forms. But I'm trying to use my words carefully. The risk in the capital markets is something that Congress has said. Let's ensure we don't have fraud, manipulation, and those risk taking.
Gambling in a casino, I suspect a number of Americans would be watching that news from months ago and wondering what is the difference between this and gambling in a casino. And I think that is a flavor of that kind of gives viewers a flavor of what to expect when it comes to the tensions between the two parties on this and the complicated issues that someone like Gary Gensler is confronting when deciding what to do about all of this, Allison.
Yeah, he's going to have to make some tough calls. Sahil, thank you so much. It is National Nurses Day, and we are celebrating the nurses who have gotten us through this past year, providing comfort and company for COVID patients who would otherwise be in the hospital alone. Today, co-anchor Hoda Kotb has some of their incredible stories.
The nurse after nurse after nurse would come in and just not hold me, but just touch me. And it's like I felt it. It was their personal touch that I felt the most.
Just 3 months ago, 62-year-old John Tillotson was fighting for his life at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City. The memories of battling COVID-19 are still so fresh, he struggles to find the words.
My fever was about 105. I had all sorts of hallucinations and nightmares, and they were horrible, horrible things.
His critical care nurses, Andrew Wong and Christine McLaughlin, take care of the sickest of patients, and now John was one of them.
With Mr. Tillotson, I think the thing that I remember the most was he kind of walking along that borderline of being very, very sick.
I think he was a little frightened to come in. He really wanted just to get home to his family.
But in a COVID intensive care unit where no visitors are allowed, the nurses are the patient's family. Andrew Wong even leaving encouraging notes for John while he slept.
I appreciated the idea that every day these people came to work, did what they did, and saved my life.
28-year-old Brian Morales of Queens, New York, agrees his nurses went above and beyond to be there for him when his family couldn't.
You don't know, there was days that I kept crying because I needed my mom to be next to me. The moment that I needed someone to be next to me because my family wasn't there, they were.
Brian was in the Long Island Jewish Forest Hills Hospital for 52 days battling COVID-19 on a ventilator for much of that time. His critical care nurses were Imtiaz Hanif and Star Lentz, who was 6 months pregnant at the time. They remember him vividly, not just because of how sick he was, but for how young.
We had to respond to his rapid response, which is something that they call overhead when a patient's crashing. First thing I know is he was my age.
The next thing he noticed was Brian turning blue.
But I remember specifically right before we had to sedate him, his last words were like, "Oh, please don't let me die."
And we're praying, like, God, just get us through the night. Give us the strength to deal with whatever we have coming towards us, because our goal is for these people to go home to their families.
And 7 weeks later, after a miraculous recovery, Brian Morales did go home to his family and now is back at work doing what he loves.
Today, every day that I wake up, I feel so excited. I feel like every day is a new opportunity for you literally to explore the world.
And John Tillotson, father of 3 and grandfather of 9, has since written a letter to his care team.
It was to let them know that the work they do was not just for me to survive and not just for my benefit, but my wife, my kids, my grandkids, all of the family, everybody. It's sort of like they did that for all of them. And the benefit is not just what they did for me, but what they did for this entire family.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.